Tonight, we turn back to Appalachia in the autumn of 1908, where fog clung to hills like damp wool and the nights carried more silence than the living could stand. Black Hollow lay at the valley's edge, a wound in the earth where the sun seemed reluctant to enter. Searchers with lanterns once stood there, calling names into the dark. Their voices returned warped, stretched, as though the trees themselves were answering back. 3 children had vanished. No blood, no footprints, no final scream. Just an unfinished supper cooling on the table and a farmhouse mother staring at empty bowls. The hounds lost their scent at the hollow's rim, circling in confusion as if the trail dissolved into air. The sheriff filed his report in plain ink, unresolved. But the people whispered something else. They spoke of lights in the trees, of laughter where no laughter should be, of children seen walking in single file along ridgelines where no path existed. And more than a century later, the questions still bleed through the soil. Did the mountain claim them? Did someone lead them away? Or is Black Hollow still keeping them, hidden just beyond the reach of daylight? It was written in childish scrawl, the pencil pressing too hard against the page, tearing faint grooves into the paper beneath. The diary entry, found decades later in a farmhouse trunk, carried only a single line. We hear them calling from the hollow again. Tonight, we go if they ask. No names, no date, just that unnerving promise etched by an unsteady hand. The words looked innocent, but the deeper you stared at them, the more the page seemed to breathe. You could imagine the children huddled in the flickering light of a kerosene lamp, writing down what they could not tell the adults. Because who would believe them? Voices from the woods? An invitation from the dark? Black Hollow is not the kind of place that forgives curiosity. Nestled in the Appalachian spine where fog slinks low and the trees lean as if eavesdropping, the hollow has always been a wound in the earth, damp, echoing, and wrong. Local children, if they wandered too far, returned with vacant eyes or not at all. The diary was the last record of the Harris siblings, 3 children who vanished one October night in 1908, leaving no footprints past the edge of the hollow. Search parties scoured the woods for weeks. Dogs lost the scent as if the children had been swallowed whole. Theories sprouted like fungi. Abduction, sacrifice, wild animals, even the land itself conspiring against them. But the worst part? The Harris case wasn't the first, nor the last. Generations of disappearances bled into one another, forming a tapestry of absence across the mountainside. Families buried empty coffins. Pastors muttered warnings and sermons. And always, in every retelling, someone whispered about the children of Black Hollow. It's easy to dismiss ghost stories until you find handwriting carved into it beneath a rotting floorboard. The final desperate scribbles of someone too young to spell properly, but old enough to know fear. The letters shake as though written while listening for footsteps or whispers. That diary entry, that single line, feels less like history and more like a summons. They heard something in the hollow, and they went, and we, more than a century later, are still following them in. 1908 in West Virginia was not an era of gentle twilight and pastoral innocence. It was an age of coal dust, shotgun justice, and families clinging to the earth like barnacles to rock. The mountains were alive, but not in any friendly sense. They groaned with industry, rivers dammed and diverted, forests stripped bare, while the town that clung to valleys pulsed with miners coughing up black phlegm and mothers sewing until their knuckles bled. And yet, in the cracks of that brutality, there was superstition. You couldn't swing a lantern without hitting a folk tale. Witches with eyes like cinders. Singing streams that could drown you if you lingered. A hollow where sound echoed wrong, as though something unseen spoke alongside your own voice. The Appalachians have always been fertile soil for myth, because when you live that close to darkness, both natural and human, you need stories to survive. The Harris family lived on the fringe of that uneasy balance, a patch of farmland inherited from generations that never quite managed to leave. Their house stood less than 2 miles from Black Hollow. That name wasn't poetic flourish. It was descriptive, a gash in the mountain slope where sunlight rarely broke through, even in summer. Locals avoided it in the same way they avoided looking too long at a grave. Children never listen. They hear the grown-ups' hushed warnings and mistake them for dares. The woods surrounding the hollow were a playground of roots and mud, cicada screams, and creek beds. For the Harris siblings, those woods were escape from chores, from the hunger their parents tried to hide, from the endless grind of early 20th century rural life. Context matters here. This was a country where missing children were more common than headlines let on. With no centralized system, no photographs circulated nationwide, no FBI kidnapping unit, a vanished child was a private grief, not a national emergency. Rural disappearances rarely made it past county gossip, unless something about them reeked of the uncanny. And Black Hollow reeked. Families whisper about strange bonfires seen flickering at its rim. Travelers swore they heard children's laughter where no child lived. And always, the stories ended the same way, with someone missing. But when 3 children vanish in the same night and all the lantern light searching turns up nothing, no fabric caught on thorns, no bare footprints in the mud, no signs of a struggle, the landscape itself becomes a suspect. And that's what 1908 Appalachia gave us. A stage thick with coal smoke, superstition, and suspicion. A land that could eat you alive and never burp. Against that backdrop, the Harris children's disappearance wasn't just tragedy. It was confirmation of every whispered warning. The Harris children were not remarkable, not in the sense history usually demands. They weren't prodigies or heirs of some fortune or precocious saints destined for sainthood. They were, in truth, achingly ordinary, 3 small voices in a valley that swallowed noise whole. And maybe that's why their vanishing hit harder. Because if the world could erase children like these, it could erase anyone. There was Ruth, the eldest at 12, old enough to be her mother's right hand, too young to be free. Her schoolteacher described her handwriting as deliberate, which in rural translation meant she was careful, serious, someone who pressed down too hard when writing about chores or the weather. Her diary, the one later discovered, reads not like a girl's but like someone rehearsing adulthood. Lists of seeds, tallying eggs, even complaints about her father's cough. And yet, tucked between the margins, odd asides, the hollow sang last night. Or, Tommy says he saw lights where no light should be. Tommy was 9, restless, the sort of boy who could find danger in an empty field. His pockets were said to be full of marbles, bent nails, chicken feathers, treasure scavenged from a world that gave him little else. Neighbors recalled him as loud, but his sister's notes suggest a boy prone to silences too, sitting at the edge of the cornfield, staring toward the tree line, as though waiting for something. Then there was Annie, just 6, and already treated like a shadow. She clung to Ruth's skirt, spoke in whispers, and was remembered by the preacher's wife as the kind of child you forget is in the room. Her only surviving words come secondhand from a cousin. She asked me once if trees could be hungry. Together, the Harris children were ordinary lives stitched into an extraordinary setting. A family shack barely holding against the elements. A father's lungs collapsing from cold dust. A mother who never stopped moving. Poverty pressing at all angles. But children have a way of carving small sanctuaries. They had the creek, the swing made of a crooked rope, the woods, especially the woods. The Harris siblings lived close enough to Black Hollow that their games bled into the boundaries adults swore to respect. They didn't care. Why would they? The Hollow wasn't a graveyard to them. It was an adventure. But adventures are only safe when the rules are real, and in that valley, rules bent strangely. what adults call curses and warnings, the Harris children read as invitations, and so they became the perfect subjects for the Hollow's appetite. Curious enough to follow, poor enough to be overlooked, innocent enough to vanish without explanation. October 17, 1908. The day should have been unremarkable. Cold air, wood smoke hanging low, the last of the leaves crunching underfoot. But something shifted. People in the valley swore they heard bells in the distance, faint and metallic, though no church tolled that morning. Cattle lowed and kicked at their stalls, and the Harris children, restless, slipped into the woods long before the chores were done. We don't know what drew them out. Some say it was Tommy, daring the others to chase a jack-o'-lantern glow. He swore he'd seen the night before. Others claim Ruth was the one who insisted, scribbling in her diary that, if they call again, we must see. Annie, too young to protest, followed. What matters is that the three of them crossed the threshold, the edge where the trees thickened into Black Hollow, and never returned. By sundown, their mother noticed. The dinner table sat uneven with 3 bowls untouched. Their father, coughing blood into his kerchief, assumed they were with cousins. But by nightfall, lanterns swung across the property, voices calling names into the dark. The woods echoed back, but not quite right. Neighbors later said the trees seemed to repeat the children's names, pitched higher, almost mocking. The search began the next morning. Dozens of men scoured the underbrush, leaving ribbons of cloth tied to branches, so they wouldn't lose themselves. They found small disturbances. A broken shoelace near the creek, the imprint of bare toes in the mud, a rag doll lodged in the crook of a root. But all trails converge at the hollow's rim. And there, nothing. No footprints, no bent grass, no sign the children had gone further. It was as though the forest had drawn a line and swallowed everything past it. The preacher called it God's punishment. The sheriff muttered about wildcats. The mothers in town whispered that the hollow had taken its due. Because here's the part no one wrote down, but everyone remembered. These were not the first children to vanish. There had been the Martin boy in '89, the Caldwell twins in '94, the girl called June in '01. Each disappearance different, but the pattern clear enough that every parent carried the fear like a second heartbeat. The Harris case, though, was louder. 3 gone in one night, a family gutted at once. The search dragged on, dogs refusing to step past the hollow's threshold, lanterns flickering as if choked by unseen wind. The woods gave nothing back, not even silence, because silence is neutral. The hollow radiated something else, something active. The first disturbance wasn't just the children's disappearance. It was a realization that whatever stalked Black Hollow didn't care if you believed in it or not. Here's the thing about a disappearance in the small Appalachian Valley. The search burns bright, then burns out. After the first week, men muttered excuses about farms to tend, about coal seams waiting. Lantern oil ran thin, food went cold, and eventually, only the family kept calling names into the trees. But the Harris case didn't fade like the others. Something clung to it, something that refused to let go. Conflicting testimonies began piling up like bad debts. A farmer swore he saw 3 figures on the ridge the morning after they vanished. Children holding hands, walking single file, eyes fixed straight ahead. Another claimed he heard laughter near the creek at midnight, but when he rushed outside, there was no one. A traveling salesman, drunk in the tavern, bragged that he'd given 3 dirty-faced kids a ride toward the next county. Yet his wagon wheels left no tracks. And then came the object, a shoe, Ruth's, small and scuffed, found dangling from a low branch 20 feet inside the hollow. Not lie on the ground, dangling, laces tied in a careful bow as if placed there deliberately. The sheriff dismissed it as a prank. The family knew better. Ruth's diary even mentions tying laces too tight because of the trees. That line doesn't make sense unless you believe the woods were already whispering to her. As rumors spread, so did hysteria. Neighbors stopped letting their children wander. A schoolteacher described seeing faces in the fog when she walked past the hollow at dawn. Too small to be adults, too blurred to be real. Dogs howled nightly. One man even claimed his newborn repeated the names Ruth, Tommy, Annie in its sleep. By winter, the search had dwindled to nothing. But absence is gravity. It pulls, it bends, it warps perception. And soon, the hollow became a center of paranoia. Had someone taken the children? Human hands, human cruelty, or had the land itself claimed them? Which was worse? A murderer hiding in plain sight, or a force too ancient and indifferent for justice? Whispers of older disappearances resurfaced. The Caldwell twins' mother admitted she'd heard knocking on her door the night they went missing. 3 taps, slow, like knuckles made of wood. The Martin boys' uncle confessed he'd found the child's toy wagon near the hollow, filled with dead birds arranged in a circle. None of this had been shared before. Shame kept people silent. Or maybe fear. The Harris children weren't just gone. Their absence infected the living. It made liars of neighbors, poets of lunatics, prophets of drunks. Every testimony contradicted the last, and yet together they painted a single truth. Something in Black Hollow was watching, waiting, and using children as its language. If you read the sheriff's reports from 1908, you'd think the Harris children simply evaporated, like dew off the grass. The official record is threadbare, perfunctory, almost insulting. No evidence of foul play. Search inconclusive. Case unresolved. That's it. 3 children erased, boiled down to a shrug in ink. But outside those brittle pages, the investigation splintered into theories, some rational, some deranged, all desperate to fill the void. The lawmen clung to the usual suspects, strangers on the road, the idea of a passing tramp or a vagrant worker luring the children away. It was the neatest explanation, and maybe the most comforting, because it meant the land wasn't to blame. But no strangers were seen, no ransom demanded, no tracks left behind. The railroad man swore no one hopped the trains that week. Still, stranger danger satisfied officials enough to close the books. Others insisted the culprit was closer to home. One neighbor whispered about the father's coughing fits, claiming he was half mad with pain and killed his own children in a fever. Another pointed at the mother, suggesting she drowned in the creek out of despair. Cruel gossip, all of it, with no evidence beyond poverty and grief. But grief breeds suspicion, and suspicion in small towns festers like mold. Then came the folk explanations. Preachers talked about sin manifesting in the woods, that the hollow was God's furnace, and the children his burnt offering. Old women muttered about witches, about fetches that lured children into the dark. Some even swore the hollow itself was a mouth, and that every few years it needed feeding. These weren't just fireside tales. They were genuine hypotheses spoken aloud at church meetings, debated as a theological law. But the strangest theories sprouted from the diary Ruth left behind. Hidden among her dull notes about chores were those odd entries about lights, voices, trees that seemed to hum. When the diary surfaced during the search, a handful of men took it seriously. One even suggested the Harris children weren't dead at all, but taken elsewhere, into the hollow beneath the earth, maybe even into another world. A primitive echo of what we'd now call missing time. Abduction, a dimensional slip. Evidence was thin, yes, but the absences themselves became clues. The dogs refusing to enter the hollow. The missing footprints. The shoe laced onto a branch. Each pointed away from human hands and toward something stranger, something systematic. Of course, the official story was simpler. Children wandered, got lost, died. The mountains eat the careless. But the locals knew better. Too many vanishings, Too many eerie echoes, too many diary entries like roofs. When you read those pages, you don't see a child lost in fantasy. You see someone documenting carefully, quietly, what it feels like to be stalked by the invisible. The winter after the Harris children vanished should have been the end of the story. Snow smothered the woods, froze the creeks, and buried any lingering tracks. Families turned inward, fireplaces roaring, prayers muttered more out of routine than conviction. But Black Hollow doesn't respect closure. It has a way of dragging grief back into the light and twisting it into spectacle. The breakdown came in February of 1909, when a hunter named Elias Carr staggered into town, white as frost and mumbling scripture. He'd been tracking deer along the ridge when he swore he heard children singing, not distant, close, as if circling him. He followed the sound, rifle in hand, until he stumbled on a clearing deep inside the hollow. There, he said, hung 3 rag dolls in the branches, swaying though the air was still. Each doll bore a scrap of clothing that neighbors later identified: Ruth's apron, Tommy's patched trouser leg, Annie's ribbon. The sheriff dismissed it as a cruel prank. But Elias never hunted again. He stopped speaking altogether within weeks, sitting mute on his porch until he died that spring. His neighbors swore he'd carved the names of the Harris children into his own doorframe, over and over, as if warding something off. Then came the collapse of official patience. When the rag dolls made gossip spread like infection, townsfolk demanded answers. Accusations flared. Some insisted a secret society, Masons maybe, or coal barons, were staging sacrifices to keep the land appeased. Others claimed the children were alive, hidden in the hollow by hermits or outlaws. Search parties turned into mobs. Men carried torches into the woods, firing shots into the trees. They found nothing but smoke and fear. But the true turning point was the mother. In March, nearly 6 months after the disappearance, she arrived at church service trembling, clutching a folded scrap of paper she claimed had been left on her windowsill overnight. It wasn't written in her children's hands, nor any script she recognized. Crooked symbols, like letters written backward, jagged, and wrong. At the bottom, though, one word was unmistakable: Mama. The congregation broke. Some sobbed, others raged. The preacher declared the devil himself walked in Black Hollow. The sheriff refused to investigate further, calling it hysteria. The mother, meanwhile, stopped eating, stopped speaking, except to repeat, "They're not gone. They're waiting." This was no longer a disappearance. It was contagion. Rational boundaries collapsed under the weight of rumor, grief, and dread. And that's how a mystery becomes a haunting. Not when bodies are found, but when absence itself drives people mad. There was no resolution, at least not in the comforting sense of trials and verdicts and bodies laid to rest. The Harris children's case slipped, officially, into the void of unsolved, a bureaucratic coffin nailed shut with a single sentence: cause unknown. But that didn't stop people from digging, speculating, whispering. If anything, the absence of closure kept the wound open, raw, and festering. Some clung to the human explanations. Runaways, they said. The children had simply fled, tired of poverty, of cold dust, of coughing fathers, and endless chores. They joined a traveling troupe, or hitched a train west, or disappeared into the crush of some factory town. It's neat, it's plausible, and yet it collapses under scrutiny. How does a 6-year-old walk 2 counties over without food, without shoes, leaving no footprints, no witnesses, no bones? Others swore the Harris siblings were killed by a neighbor, by a drifter, by their own parents. There were hushed conversations about shallow graves in cornfields, about fathers driven mad by sickness, about mothers who couldn't bear to feed 3 hungry mouths. But none of those whispers came with proof, just suspicion, sharpened into rumor until a family's grief became its own trial. And then the theories that refuse to die, that the hollow itself was the culprit, that the children hadn't been killed, but taken. The rag dolls, the diary entries, the bells, the voices in the trees, all lined up like breadcrumbs pointing towards something older, something hungrier than man. The Appalachians are not young mountains. They've seen civilizations rise and rot, bones crushed into their soil. Perhaps the hollow is one of those places where the skin of the world is thinner, where whatever waits underneath can reach through and snatch what it wants. And what it wanted always was children. Even now, the case remains a labyrinth of contradictions. If Ruth's diary was true, they heard voices. So whose? If Elias Carr told the truth, who dressed those rag dolls and why? If the mother's strange note was genuine, who crept to her window to leave it? Every answer dissolves into another question, like mist curling through trees. The Harris children never came back. No bones, no bodies, not even a shred of fabric beyond that apron, that ribbon, that shoelace. Their absence is more complete than death. It is erasure. And erasure does not resolve. It lingers. It waits. It beckons you to keep staring at the hollow, wondering if tonight you'll hear the same voices that called to them. The Harris disappearance poisoned the valley. It wasn't just grief. It was rot spreading through generations. Children weren't allowed to wander anymore. Doors were barred at sundown. Men who once scoffed at superstition began crossing themselves when they passed the hollow. Everyone adapted, as though living beside a predator. The Harris family dissolved under the strain. The father's lungs collapsed within a year, his coughing drowning him in his own blood. The mother outlived him but became a phantom in her own right, seen wandering the hollow's edge at night, muttering to the trees. She carried no lantern. Some claimed she expected the dark to guide her. Others whispered she was leaving herself as bait, hoping the hollow would trade her life for her children's. It never did. The town never recovered either. Not really. The case turned Black Hollow into a landmark of dread. Teenagers dared each other to walk its perimeter. Preachers used it as shorthand for sin. Outsiders came to gawk, to sketch, to tell stories by firelight. The valley became less a place of work and worship, and more a stage for its own mythology. And once a place becomes myth, it's doomed to wear the mask forever. Disappearances continued. Not every year, not predictably, but enough that the name Hollow carried weight like a curse. In 1922, a boy was found half dead at its edge, babbling about children playing inside the trees. In 1936, a girl vanished for 3 days, then reappeared on her porch at dawn, barefoot, unable to explain where she'd been. She carried a ribbon knotted into her hair that her mother swore had belonged to Annie Harris. Over time, folklorists latched on, weaving the Harris case into a tapestry of Appalachian myth alongside Mothman, the Bell Witch, and tales of thin places where the world leaks. Some argued it was mass hysteria, others that it was a cultural expression of generational trauma. But the locals, those who live with the shadow, rarely argued at all. They knew the story wasn't metaphor. It was survival advice disguised as legend. The legacy of the Harris children is not justice, not closure, not memory preserved in stone. It's a scar. Their names became warnings. Their story became a ritual retold in whispers to keep other children from straying too far. And yet, even warnings attract curiosity. Some say that's the Hollow's cleverest trick. It leaves you with questions instead of corpses. And questions, unlike bones, never decay. There's a reason the story of the Harris children refuses to die. It isn't just tragedy. It's the shape of fear itself. The idea that the ground beneath us is not solid, that the world could decide at any moment to unmake you and leave nothing behind. And worse, that it prefers the young, the small, the ones still fragile enough to believe in voices calling their names. Think about that diary entry again, the one scratching Ruth's unsteady hand. We hear them calling from the hollow again. Tonight we go if they ask. It doesn't read like a warning. It reads like acceptance, as if the children weren't dragged but invited, as if the hollow didn't steal them but persuaded them. There's something more terrifying in that than in any clawed beast or lurking killer. The possibility that the missing went willingly, smiling, into the dark. And if you strip away folklore, superstition, cold dust, and grief, what's left is this. 3 children gone without a trace, never found, no evidence, no answers. Their absence is the answer. And maybe that's what Black Hollow feeds on. Not bodies, but stories. Every theory, every whisper warning, every parent tighten their grip on a child's hand is another offering. The Hollow doesn't just consume children. It consumes memory, community, history, turning everything it touches into a riddle. The question isn't what happened to the children of Black Hollow. The question is why the Hollow still wants us talking about them. Why it insists on echoing through time, keeping the wound raw. Why, when you stand at its edge even now, you feel the pull, the certainty that if you call their names into the dark, something would answer. And here's the thought that keeps me awake. If the Harris children are still out there, in whatever place the Hollow hides, what do they sound like now? Do they whisper warnings to keep us away? Or do they call to us, the way they once heard voices calling to them, asking us to step inside and join them? The Hollow never gives back what it takes. It only multiplies the silence. And maybe that's the cruelest resolution of all. Not knowing whether children were lost, taken, or transformed. Only knowing that the Hollow is never done. Locals whisper that if you stand at the edge of Black Hollow on a cold autumn night and softly call the name Harris, you'll hear laughter answer back. Childlike at first, but stretched, distorted, not entirely human. Hello everyone, and thank you so much for listening. As usual, please leave any comments or feedback you may have, and I hope to see you all again in the next case.